Okay, before I get into the story, there are a few things I need to explain about my country, South Africa, for you to fully understand the story. In South Africa, it's normal to have high brick walls with electric gates, electric fences, alarms, etc. And the crime here can be pretty bad. It's also pretty normal to have big gardens. My family and I are big animal lovers, so at the time, we had 6 dogs. 2 Shar-Peis, 2 German short-haired pointers, and 2 dachshunds. With that being said, our dogs roam freely in and out of the garden, as it's obviously enclosed. We usually leave the veranda door open during the day for them to do their thing. Another thing about South Africa, it's normal to have a live-in domestic worker, a maid, or a gardener. Like the average family usually employs them. It's not only for wealthy people, which seems to be a thing in other countries. For the story, our DW is Ellie, and our gardener is Vince. So, this happened in 2007 and I was 9 years old. My older brother was 10, and I had just gotten our first cell phones that day. My dad surprised us after work. You may think it's a bit young, but it was used for emergencies or to communicate with our parents. Anyways, it's an important piece of info for the story. We don't usually leave our veranda door open at night due to security reasons, but I remember it being a hot summer night that night. So of course, this night of all nights, the veranda door was wide open and the dogs were doing their thing in the garden. My brother and I were in my parents' room setting up our new cell phones, all excited. Nellie's daughter, Anne, who's like an older sister to us, she was 18, was helping my brother and I. My dad was somewhere in the house and my mom was in the bath. I specifically remember Anne having a comment about how the dogs would not shut up and how annoying it was. And that's when I noticed it too. Sure, they would bark, but it was usually the dachshunds that yapped when the bigger dogs just chilled. Plus, it would only happen for a few minutes and then they would get over it. But something was different that night, as even the bigger dogs were barking nonstop. My dad appeared in his room and mentioned to us that he had noticed the dogs' incessant barking, and he was going to go check if everything was okay. No alarm bells went off on my head, and I don't believe my dad thought anything was amiss either, because my brother had asked to investigate with him, and my dad agreed. I was obviously too engrossed in my new Sony Ericsson. My dad ventured out to our garden with my brother in tow, when my dad had noticed that the dogs were all grouped, growling and going nuts at the dark corner behind our in-the-ground swimming pool. The best way to describe it is our garden beyond our pool hits like a slight decline. So we have a few steps leading down the hill to the bottom end of our garden. We usually have a lamp that lights it up, but my dad had noticed how that lamp seemed to be off, which confused him because he could have sworn it worked the other night. Either way, my dad said he got his gut-wrenching feeling because of this and because of how out of character the dogs were acting. He called after them and they would usually come running, but tonight they all seemed to just look at him and then turn back around and continue going crazy at this dark corner down the steps. My dad told my brother to go back inside of the house and get a torch, sort of using it as an excuse for my brother not to come with him because of his feeling. When my brother went back inside, my dad slowly approached the steps. He noticed how the dog seemed to be snapping at whatever it was, hiding just out of view in the darkness. As he got to the steps, he noticed that the lamp was smashed. Confused, he inched to these steps, and as he put 2 and 2 together, it was too late. My dad, being an ex-vet and avid hunter, felt something cold against his temple, and immediately knew that it was a gun. Out of the darkness stepped 4 other men in balaclavas, all armed. Shocked, he stood frozen on the steps. The man holding the gun to his head was instantly aggressive and asked him where my brother was. that he saw my dad come out with my brother, but my brother went back into the house. Why? My dad said something came over him, and before he knew what he was saying, he responded with, "He's gone inside to press the panic button." As he said that, he saw how all of these guys started to panic. They started speaking in a different language. It's not common for people to speak it, but my dad had actually grown up on a farm where he learned it fluently because of the farm workers. The aggressive guy holding the gun said in a different language, "Crap, the cops will be here any minute. Let's just kill this guy and grab what we can and go." The others seemed apprehensive, and a smaller guy seemed really on edge, and continued to say how he can't go back to jail again, and that they needed to get the heck out before the cops showed up, which would be any minute. He was panicking. My dad then fed on this guy's fear. My dad then interrupted them, speaking English, pretending to not understand what they were saying, and said that we usually have armed response vehicles that drove in our area, and since my brother had pushed the panic button so long ago, they'd probably be here any second. And that did it. My dad watched as their plan unraveled before them, and the smaller scared guy started freaking out all of the other guys, saying that they needed to leave ASAP or else they would be caught. He seemed to make the others more nervous and lose confidence, until they started full-on bickering amongst themselves, their plan slowly turning to crap, as a third guy put it. The aggressive one, pointing the gun at my dad's head, slowly lowered it as they had started fighting, losing focus on my dad and shifting his focus onto his crew. My dad then used this as an opportunity to slowly back up the steps and turn to dart to the house. As luck would have it, as my dad ran into the veranda door, my oblivious brother was heading out with a torch. My dad scooped him up under his arm mid-ran and sprinted into the house, not even closing the door behind him. Silly, I know, but I think he just wanted to get my brother inside as quick as possible, without even thinking. Anne and I were obviously also oblivious to everything, when my dad rushed through the bedroom door, slammed it shut and told us to go upstairs into the attic, that there are 5 guys with guns outside, and they're here to hurt us. Get upstairs now. And my heart sank. I remember my body automatically responding and me sprinting to the stairs with Anne right behind me. My mom ran out of the bathroom in a towel, not too far behind. We sat there in the darkness and silence. I swear that you could hear a pin drop. I think we were all just waiting to hear something below us in the rooms. My mom cursed, saying that she didn't have a phone, and neither did my dad. But in my hand was my brand new Sony Ericsson. No better emergency to use it than right now. My mom dials the police, and I kid you not, they asked where we lived. We explained and they told us that it wasn't in their jurisdiction. Sorry. Click, and the line went dead. We're now not only crapping ourselves, but we're flabbergasted too. My mom starts cursing like a sailor again, and that's when my dad realizes, dang, he didn't close the veranda door. And what about Ellie and Vince, who are in their rooms, blissfully unaware of the danger that they're in? He gets his firearm in the safe in the attic and tells us that whatever we hear, to not come downstairs, to stay hidden no matter what. Now I'm sobbing, begging my dad not to leave us, but he tells us that he has to go and get Ellie and Vince before something bad happens to them. Now there's even more tears as reality hits that there's 2 other people still in danger. And understandably in hysterics because she's also fearing for her mom downstairs. My dad disappears and the air is thick with tension. We can still hear the dogs going crazy, indicating that those men were still on our property. My mom then calls another number, the armed security that drives around the area, and they say that they'll be over in about 10 minutes. They say to wait and stay hidden until they ring our bell at the gate. We all wait in silence, fearing that we'll hear a gunshot or anything indicating that these men are in our house. But there was just silence. The only sound was the dog's barks outside. After what seemed like hours, mostly likely a couple of minutes, We heard stomping coming up the stairs and my heart rate quickened. I remember shutting my eyes and praying that it was my dad with Ellie and Vince. Luckily it was. We all hid for a while and no one dared to speak. The dogs had seemed to calm down considerably, but they were still barking every now and then. The gate intercom rang and my dad told us to wait while he checked if it was the security company, and sure enough it was. He opened up and the nightmare was over. I remember standing up and my knees buckling from the adrenaline my body had endured. The armed security somehow notified the right police, and everyone investigated the garden. They found that there was actually 7 pairs of footprints, and that these guys bent these spikes on our wall and just climbed over. We got an electrical fence shortly after, so there must have been 2 other guys hiding in these shadows that my dad hadn't seen, which is actually creepy in its own right. South Africa's violent crime is quite bad, and it's too common for horrible things to happen during home invasions. I was obviously so young at the time that I didn't know the horrors of the world, and I was just scared of my family getting hurt. But now that I'm older, just the thought of 4 women being in the house and my mom being in nothing but a bath towel gives me chills to this day. The cops said the fact that there were so many guys instead of like 1 to 3 indicates that these guys possibly had sinister intentions. Thank goodness nothing happened to my family, and I'm forever thankful for my dad's quick thinking regarding the panic button. Also, I'm so glad my dad understands multiple languages and could manipulate these situations to benefit us. Lastly, my family will forever be in debt to our good boys and girls that warned us that night. A terrifying and life-changing outcome would have 100% happened that night, had it not been for our incredible dogs. From that day onwards, my dad always gave them leftover rice or meat with their dinner. R.I.P. Impy, Shudo, Dash, Fudge, Winkles, and Pikachu. I'm sure there is a special place in heaven reserved for you angels. This happened to me when I was a kid, 10 to be exact. I grew up in a military family and lived in the Middle East for a significant portion of my life. Because of this, we traveled frequently to different countries because of the low cost and proximity. On this particular vacation, we flew into Cairo, Egypt, for a long weekend, and we only lived like 2 to 3 hours away. It was late at night and we were staying at the Marriott Hotel, which had a taxi shuttle service that was supposed to pick us up. For some reason, our driver never showed, so we were forced to take a regular cab to take us there, which took forever to find that late at night. We finally found one that was offering us a pretty good deal. They don't run by meters, instead they just give a flat rate that they choose, and headed towards the hotel. Out of nowhere, another taxi basically T-bones us in the middle of the road, causing us to stop. There aren't really defined roads in a lot of Arab places, so it isn't really that surprising that we got hit. In Arab nature, the 2 drivers get out of the cars, each yelling that it was the other's fault, and looking like they were going to throw hands. Eventually, they got back into their respective taxis and parted ways. My family and I were completely taken aback. We had been in Egypt less than 2 hours and have already had quite the adventure. When we finally got to the hotel, exhausted as it must have been at 3 a.m. by this point, our driver helped us get all of our bags out and get settled, and told us that he felt so bad about the car accident that he offered to pick us up the next morning and take us to the Great Pyramids, which was on our agenda for a super cheap rate. My parents agreed and decided on a time for him to come, though I can't remember when. Flash forward to the next morning. Everyone is ready for the day, excited to see how crazy it was going to be. Our driver was outside waiting for us, leaning against the car like someone in an old movie would, right when he said he would be there. I'm a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl that had a deep tan at the time, and being in Egypt, that was a rare sight. When the driver saw me in the daylight, he gave me the creepiest, most unsettling look that sent chills down my spine, even as a 10-year-old. I knew something wasn't right with him. Nonetheless, we got in his taxi and headed towards the pyramids. He continued to try and talk to me and joke around with me the whole ride, something I found to be extremely creepy and bold since both my parents were in the cab. We get super close and there's an entrance that people can go through and walk the long distance to the pyramids, and there's an entrance that taxis can go through. You have to pay to see them. It's strange but true. Our driver keeps making jokes about my blonde hair and blue eyes and bringing up that he could get me into the pyramids for free, so my parents wouldn't have to pay the extra ticket price. We laughed it off and my parents paid him and said thank you and began to exit the taxi. I don't remember how it happened, but at some point after I got out of the car he did too, and he directed me towards his trunk. I was confused and thought that we had forgotten something, so I stayed behind as my parents walked towards the gate to get whatever I thought we had left. The driver pops the trunk, but there wasn't anything in it. He grabbed my arm and put a hand on my back, trying to push me into the trunk, and said, "I'm getting you in for free," over and over again as I resisted. Naturally, I freaked out and screamed out to my mom and dad at the top of my lungs, terrified. When they heard me and noticed that I wasn't behind them, they started sprinting back to the car. When the driver heard me scream, he immediately let go of me, closed the trunk, and drove away just as my parents started to run to me. I was crying my eyes out, terrified out of my mind knowing that a taxi driver tried to put me in his trunk, and drove away the second that I screamed for help. It's scary to think what could have happened to me had he been stronger and more prepared, or faster. He is the reason that I am still terrified of taxis, Ubers, Lyfts, and any car service of that nature. This happened quite a while ago. My lifestyle at the time was very high risk. This story means a lot to me as it restored my much needed faith in humanity. To explain why this incident meant so much to me, I need to provide a bit of backstory. I live in a really sketchy part of town. The particular building I lived in was a refurbished loft type with a very ugly history. You could still see the damage in the concrete walls from all the gunfire that it had taken at one point. Talking the pizza guy into delivering was always fun. "No sir, it's not still a crime scene. Yes, real people live here." There was a local gas station within walking distance. Your typical shady place populated by shady people doing shady things. I had and still have a tendency to be somewhat chatty and polite when spoken to by strangers, especially if I frequent that store and see them often. I wound up making friends with a man named Houston, who had a talent for obtaining recreational plant life. We would hang out and philosophize about life and the like. I just felt like he had a good soul. I was coming home from a bar that I frequented one night. It was a Friday and that area was a popular night spot, so at closing time cabs would line up. I was quite drunk but sober enough to know better than to drive. The cab driver was talkative and I was not. I just wanted to go home and watch the world spin. Almost immediately out of his mouth came some of the most lecherous and disgusting things I'd ever heard. He would arc his neck around while driving, lick his lips and say just horrible things. And the worst part was not only did he have me in a moving vehicle, but he knew where I lived. I had no phone and just enough money for the ride home, and I was terrified. "You want me to pull in so I can lick you?" "No thank you, I'd like to go home and vomit." Being the smartass that I was, I said that. It was as if I hadn't said anything at all to the man though. He kept turning around and reaching out to grab me as I swerved out of his reach. "Hey, show me him, I want to see him." The situation escalated when he started to drive around aimlessly, pulling into dark complexes and slowing down to try and grab me. I had to do something, so I did something that I don't think he was expecting. I flirted with him. I leaned over the front seat and gave him my best drunk and seductive face and said, "Do you want to party?" He stopped, looking blank for a moment before a huge grin widening across his face. "Oh yeah, where do you want to party? You want to party here?" He started to adjust himself and I wanted to rip that frickin' thing off. "No, not here, let's get some beer and go to my place." He agreed and I led him to my local gas station. "Pull in here and I'll go get some. What do you like?" I said sweetly. He said he didn't care, and as soon as he parked, I grabbed my bag and got out. He sat there waiting. My voice must have had an obvious tone of panic as I asked the lady behind the bulletproof glass, "Is Houston here?" She looked concerned and shouted for him. He came out from the back. I was so relieved and in one hysterical breath, I told him everything. The expression on his face darkened, and he said to me very curtly, "You stay here." I walked to the window as he exited the store. He took 3 steps outside, whistled, and with arms out on either side, he made a "come here" motion. Out of the darkness came 20 really scary guys from both sides. He pointed to the cab and said something that I didn't quite make out. Whatever it was, they swarmed the cab and they tried to flip it over. That cab burned rubber peeling out of the parking lot. The men then looked back at the store window and Houston laughed, nodded, and they disappeared back into the darkness. It was surreal. My jaw was on the floor and Houston came back inside with a grin. I don't think he'll be back. I couldn't thank him enough. He was my hero at that point, hands down. It had started to rain, so he and his friend walked me home under a giant umbrella. There are no words to describe the restoration of my faith in humanity that night. Cliché as it sounds, there really is light in the darkest of places, and kindness in the most unexpected of places.